How's it going, everybody? And today I want to talk about something interesting. Recently, at least as 2015, there has been a resurgence in philosophy of idealism and panpsychism. There are many different types of panpsychists. There are ones that are idealists, there are ones that are materialists, there are ones that are dualists, there are ones that are monists. There are many types in general, right? And it was until since 2019 where there's been academic books publishing for their defense because recent discovery of quantum entanglement, a quantum approach to consciousness, the universe is now local thanks to Bell's theorem, etc. and etc. Now, I am a reductive physicalist. There are many different types of reductive physicalists, right? And I will make a case why the idealist and the panpsychist approach, at least all versions of it, with one exception, I will say in the very end, is wrong, and why, to be more specific, a reductive physicalist approach is correct of consciousness. But there are many different types of it. Which is the consensus among scientists and philosophers, right? Which is a mix of the type identity, also known as mind-brain identity theory, functionalism, and computationalism, also known as computational theory of the mind. This is where the AI stuff comes in. And mind-brain identity theory has been debunked, right? But there's a specific version of it that is part of the functionalist approach. You can be a functionalist and not be a mind-brain identity theorist, right? So it's not obligatory, right? Yeah, we'll make a case. I will put a link in the description about multiple books and articles that go a little more detail, right? This is heavily based off the writings of Richard Carrier, who is of mind-brain identity functionalist approach of consciousness like I am. And we go into more detail of his approach. Instead of reading more of the article itself, I think you should read it. I will focus more of the response and where he goes into more detail of specific areas. Why this approach is correct and why other things related to it, like a psychological view of personal identity, which is the dominant view among scientists and philosophers, is correct, and how this actually promotes cryonics and myopia is actually possible scientifically. For example, the people who are singularity, although they have weird views about technology and consciousness and IQ, they're right about two things. The one, they will achieve human level consciousness, and number two, they will eventually be smarter than us. In my case, to be upperly optimistic, somewhere in the 2060-2070, so 50-60 years from now will be possible, and that's basically the most time frame most experts anyway. So yeah, the best approach to study the consciousness is called the information integration theory, or IDT. That consciousness is a property of reality itself, and that is irreducible. That's how people view it that way, but that's not how it case. The actual theory does not really entail any either proposition, so that's just the problem with semantics, right? For example, when it comes to qualia, everything's reduced to the physical qualia. Take away enough parts of the computer generate the output, and you no longer get the output. So the output is epistemically irreducible, but not casually irreducible, not any more than a car. And to understand when we talk about consciousness and personal identity, they're technically two different things. A person is a stored collection of data. They remain a person even when totally unconscious. We are not talking about how they're the same thing. They're technically separate. Not that we are conscious of when we talk about conscious period, not that we are conscious of your identity. Who you are, your memory, skill, desire, personality, etc. is among what you can be conscious of, but it is not your consciousness. Consciousness does not exist at a span of time below 30 milliseconds. It is a complex computational process that requires at least 30 milliseconds to generate, and for many features of self-model, far more average time to assemble 500 milliseconds, as the discovery by Lipet. But you exist even when you aren't conscious. Obviously, dreamless sleep. Even a coma does not disintegrate you. It just shut down your mind so you cannot experience anything because your brain isn't generating any experience. That would be considered a philosophical zombie? Probably. Except that it doesn't do anything. It can't talk, think, manifest qualia, hence failing, whatever thought experiment you argue against physicalism. And the smaller unit of time perceivable in consciousness is established by experiment at the cinemascope, employed by most commonly in subliminal signal studies. We found that the average to be around twice the standard signal length used in many subliminal signal studies, which is why film projection and television work at 24 frames per second, or 124 equals 52 frames per second, which is greater than 30 milliseconds. Yes, the brain must generate consciousness to build a narrative memory and thus an identity model, but the generation remains time-consuming process spanning a minimum of 30 milliseconds. The stored results are not the same thing as the process that generates the result to be stored. As to the time span being greater than 30 milliseconds or 1/30 of the second, it discussed that in the article these types of studies that it shows this to be the case. Again, a person is a sort of set of data, not consciousness. Consciousness is only the model your brain builds of you, something accurately we know now, think because evolution is a bitch. You are what you are conscious of. You are not your consciousness. And the more you remove in the stored data or mechanical function, the more you slide a person into a mere animal or a vegetative state. A person only exists when a certain accumulation of data and active potential is achieved. That's why most animals never become person, or at least in the same way that we define as a person. A mind cannot be silent because mind equals sensation or thought. It is a tautology, but that is if you mean by mind only the operation of a brain, active model building, thinking, and experiencing. If you mean by mind the stored information, the sense in which one still has mind even when completely unconscious, then you're not talking about consciousness anymore. You're just talking about the potential capacities of a brain, not their activation, which is completely different. And your personal identity remain even when unconscious. Identity is a physical pattern of arrangement, currently of neurons, the stored data of the person comprising the person, memories, inclination, personality, etc., and the causal history related thereof. A person's continuity over time continues but with a change is a functional of causal history. Consciousness is being conscious of the person you are. Consciousness is not the person itself. Computers can be programmed to care about what will happen to them. So that's not different. In fact, current AI has consciousness or self-consciousness even on the level of insects, but not in humans. But yes, being consciously aware of a self and a narrative history of that itself and making decisions to affect the future based on that awareness is what distinguishes us from most animals, although there are some exceptions to this rule, right? Like certain apes and dolphins. A person requires another history of a self or the active building of one, and to do that they have to be able to build a self-model. That includes metacognition, the ability to compare what they are, thinking to what they infer others are thinking, and thinking about what they themselves are thinking. No animal has the capacity except for a very few. Like I said, dolphins for example, or elephants even. Even they may be challenged in some cases, like some of these animals, like it is extremely primitive, at least compared to us, how complex we have, but at least with the current evidence that stands. A person does not exist if there is no cognitive self-model or none being built, because a cognitive self-model is ultimately what a person is. And this is not arbitrary, it's simply what we mean by a person, and by all inference we draw from being a person, the ability to enter social contract, to have a self-describable desire, to think about oneself, make decisions based on that self-knowledge, following only from that property and no other, so we could not arbitrarily change the definition of a person without destroying all those inferences, and thus eliminating any significance to the word person, who would then cease to mean anything relevant different from thing. Fetuses, technically speaking, are not persons. They are capable of becoming a person. They have the machinery, and the third trimester are already running the assembly program for it, which creates another key difference between having the ability to do something, have the machinery to become a person, and actually having the machinery to become a person, but the actual attributes of a personhood. i.e. the ability to metacognate the difference between self and other, does not actually arise until even many months after birth. We are hindered by an inability to test it with the communication limits, but com skills are sufficient by verifying metacognition already before the age of 2. In the United States, the Roe v. Wade, we have legally assigned person who provisionally or actually on the grounds of running the assembly program from the self-rule, i.e. if the computer is not off or not yet assembled but actually actively booting up, hence similar rights also extend to full persons who are unconscious like coma victims, and we became assigning more rights as the program started hitting milestones of actualizing personhood. No other animal has yet assembled program on this level that we have. Example of neonates are provisional persons under that specific law on the ground they are actively compiling a person in their mind. In fact, this starts in the 3rd trimester before birth. Hence, Roe v. Wade allows state interest in protecting fetal rights on the 3rd trimester and only disallowed that for earlier trimesters on the ground by compiling was not in those stages occurring. But not they do not fully become persons until sometime in their 2nd year. Severe dementia has no effect on self-model awareness or self-model building or narrative memory, if only hinders access to some of that memory or in some case the aiding of new memories to it, said they have not lost any aspects of personhood, they have only lost access to some pieces of themselves as a person. What we want to know when we want to know if there is a person, if whether there is metacognitive self-awareness or an active process of its assembly, that's an objective reality that matters, not a subjective which, because only entities with that property can engage in moral reasoning, thus be held responsible for their decision, and the only entities which that property can negotiate, enter, and maintain a social contract, thus treated as entities that do, and only entities with that property can value their own lives and thus have future that matter to them, as opposed to having no concept of a future or oneself or what life and death is. If instead, if you want a person just mean any object we want to treat a certain way, then even rocks and emotions can be a person by those standards, which render the word useless. As a matter of conceptus, a conceptus is no more a person than a stem cell in your finger, is they both have the exact same DNA and potential capabilities. There is a non-trivial difference between a disassembled computer that is being assembled and an already assembled computer that is booting up, experiencing the world, and compiling results from those experiences. Likewise, there is a non-trivial difference between a fetus that has no functioning or operating brain yet, is still being built like a computer still being built, and a fetus that does have a functioning or operating brain and is in fact actively using the brain to build and assemble of continuous mind. There's also a non-trivial difference between that and a fully cognitive person. There is actually objective factual differences. Renaming them can never change the fact, and thus no name you give them can ever change the consequence of each different fact. Hence, rights are integral to ability. Rights of provisional persons says for actual provisional persons, not potential provisional person. Only potential right exists for potential things. Actual rights only obtained for actual things, and the right of full person says for complete person, and the right of partial person says for partial person. And like I said about the mind-blowing worm, they have programmed into a robot which had just 302 neurons. Does it have a concept of time? Certainly not. Of itself? Certainly not. That's why current AI are basically conscious on the level of insects. Data is information about a thing. Numbers are a kind of information, but not the only kind, and a thing is not the same as the data that describe it. A person is like a car engine. The structure of what makes it what it is, not just the isolated bits of information. Bits of information can prepare an automobile. The arrangement of structure does that. You can have data about what the structure is, but the structure is not the data. Also, we can sometimes use software-hardware analogy in neurology, but it's not literally applicable. Software is only thing in Turing machines. Human brains are not Turing machines, they are analog, and the entire universe is basically an analog. Everything is semi-digital at this point. They're not digital computers. Software is a way to make a universal Turing machine behave like a other machine. But you could do that by skipping the Turing machine and surface and just building the machine you want to emulate. It's then all hardware, not software. The human brains are all hardware, not software. Conscious awareness is them among the things that the machine does. It's the output, not the software. Indeed, it's the output of the hardware, not of any software. The human brain is configured so all hardware, but it can change, update, expand, and reorganize, which we don't really have an analogy to it in computing yet. So we use software as the closest analogy despite being a stretch per above. Software also comes close to what we mean by short-term memory, but even then, the analogy is not exact. Computers roll out the factory with fixed hardware, not continuous reconfigured hardware. That's simply because the former is easier to manufacture and operate and maintain on the present technology. But we could, in principle, build configured hardware system, which would then be more clearly analogous to human brains. We just don't have any good reasons at the present. The fixed hardware Turing machine we have are currently far cheaper and easier to build and maintain. As what we are asking about a person, I'm not if you mean a computer has to be configured in a certain way for it to be a person, as opposed an iPhone, then that's obviously true. Just a different configuration makes a watch versus a game console or an iPhone. And a thing is how it's configured. Configure it differently and it's a different thing. This is true of literally all things whatsoever. This is also true of persons in a trivial observation. Meanwhile, all current known people are animals, obviously. So and the very principle of something that is conscious that is non-physical, like the idealist, is impossible. Like I said earlier, if you believe in something that in principle is non-physical, there is nothing holding together to maintain its existence, it becomes too unstable. It's made of nothing. It is impossible by definition. We are all technically computers. The only difference is that we are programmed to do an information processing of increasing complexity, probably produce qualia, and the most complex is self-model building, which leads to self-awareness, thus the ability to talk about the qualia of being an information processor. And thinking and remembering and learning, even a robot can do. Building a self-model and doing a meta-connection with it. Most animals, like for example your domestic cat, can do it. But there is a difference between consciousness as an experience qualia and using them to learn and make decisions. Even worms, and indeed current AI to some extent, have that. And consciousness as in self-consciousness, which does not mean learning that mirrors don't contain enemy cats. That requires no recognition of self at all. There is a reason the mirror test has been highly criticized as useless in some cultures. Even human children fail mirror tests at a late as the age of 6, yet pass sophisticated tests for metacognition, self-awareness, which normally cats do not. Personhood is a property of self-consciousness beings, or being actively building that self-consciousness, not of just anything that's conscious. Again, even worms are conscious in the loosest sense, so we need to be careful when, people who are critical the position, like I'm trying to say, it's like a mind-brain identity, mind uploading, computationalist, functionalist, say that you have to be careful with what you mean. Modern computers are multi-dimensional networks now. You own a desktop computer comprised of multiple CPUs running complex parallel programming, and the physical process is irrelevant anyway. It's the software, the actual information processing that makes the difference. Hence, neural lanterns can be run on standard machine now. In other words, everything an animal brain does, a machine can now do. The only thing left to discover is figure out the precise wiring. That's it. Configuration. There is no other difference. Robots can learn and model the structure of their own bodies now. That this inevitably entails they experience qualia as being pointed out. Daniel Dennett analyzed it from shaking the robot that has consciousness. We already replicate a complete worm brain with a software and it works, which means all qualia the worm experience the robot experience the robot experience is the same brain. Process is all that matters. Configuration, not the material it's made of. We and all other animals are also just computing inputs and generating output about a specific task that was designed and programmed to do. We are just the configuration wires with just massively complex input-output algorithm run in parallel processing through a neural net. The only fundamental difference is that we are programmed by evolution and an environment. Sentience is just another program, it's just another form of information process. Shaking the robot and the Lipson 6 Cuff bot also make complex decisions based on all sorts of complex sensory information from the surrounding environment. Hence, they learn what structure and capability their bodies have and the structure and capabilities of their environment. They are programmed with neither information and use that information to navigate environment and obstacles. Animals do the same thing, like the worm bot, which literally has exactly the same brain as the actual worm, only is made of software code instead of neurons. We are all machines. The only difference that matter among these machines is how complex the information processor is and how integrated the information processor is. This latter part is what makes the difference between, for example, the worm bar and Shaky the robot and the Lipson 6 Cuff, and some non-learning, straight-code industrial robot. Although even the latter might experience qualia, it will be simpler and vaguer than animals do or advanced bots like Worm or Shaky does, and consequently what is capable of being conscious of. There is an objective factual difference between a full person, partial person, developing person, and non-person. If a brain cannot construct a comprehension of itself as a person, if it can make a cognate a self-awareness, it cannot construct a person. No structure of a person, no person. Full stop. A non-person never have personal right because they will never be a person. Developing person will have provisional person right. They are actively developing into a person. Partial person will have partial rights, and etc. etc. A human personhood, however, is a product of more than merely the mega-cognitive structure in the prefrontal cortex. The self-model and narrative memory, etc., is constructed in across many areas of the whole cerebral cortex, which in human is vastly more complex than most animals. It is again the structure, not the label anatomical areas, that we are concerned. Being conscious of qualia is not the same thing as being conscious of oneself. All animals, even worms, must be conscious of qualia, which means the robot we build using the map of a worm's brain must be conscious of qualia. Indeed, the very same qualia that worm knew when in its previous body. Self-consciousness is far more complex output information processing. It requires a far more complex processor. Indeed, just the gigabytes of structure needed to run human consciousness alone. Gigabytes far exceed the gigabytes of structure in an entire cat's brain, and 2.5 million gigabytes in the human brain, in which at least 10% comprise the cerebral cortex, for 250,000 gigabytes, almost 3 times more than the entire domestic cat's brain. And responding to stimuli is consciousness. It can be when the information processor does simulate produce perception at its functional output. That entails qualia and has consciousness of qualia, has kind of conscience the beings have. But if you mean that it's not the same as self-consciousness, then that is true. This is why exactly we're explaining to you. A consciousness of a self is a vastly more complex output requiring of a vastly more complex information processor. So to do sufficiently complex robots like the ones I mentioned, any computer that generates and operates on perception of the environment is generating subjective experience of reality, like Shaky the robot does, and the worm bot and the Lipson Psycho bot, and all animals are doing when they are generating their subjective experience of reality. It runs a program, input generate output, generating mechanically according to physical logic gates. They are just more complex robots, it's all just wires, whether of metal or biological. Configuration of circuits, nothing more. Worms learn respond to the environment and model their environment, make decisions from that modeling that we did, the mind of the worm thing. There is no reason at all to assume that it does not come with associated qualia. Any app of perception must entail some form of qualia, unless you think only a certain level of complexity of information processing to qualia start to manifest. But just all there is to it. At a certain level of complexity, qualia are experienced. They're still not consciousness of the self. The difference is always just more wires, more circuits, more complex neural connections. That's the only difference between a worm and a dog. One has more neurons and can be more complex information processing. There is no fundamental difference, it's just complexity. The first think they have a brain of enough complexity to generate self-model and association meta-connection. That's not sufficient, as some animals like octopus have requisite neural complexity, but they avoid almost all of it doing something else. In the case of octopus, it runs in thermal camouflage system. So you have to study anatomically what do the complex brain centers do. For example, we have studied the metaconnection in primates by studying the physical operation of their mirror neuron network. Having a mirror neuron network is a structural requirement for all metaconnections, including self-meta connections. Though monkeys do not display the latter ability, though having a mirror neuron network is again not sufficient to develop complex metaconnection, much less self-connection. Those require many other structures, so we can study whether animals physically have those structures in their brain. Almost all do not, or not enough to meet the requirement. And finally, metacognition, self-cognition produces externally observable and detectable behavior. Almost no animal exhibit those behavior. They don't act on metacognitive knowledge. Therefore, they don't have metacognition knowledge. They don't act on self-cognition knowledge. Therefore, they don't have self-cognitive knowledge. If we discover the remarkable cognitive abilities of the rare few animals that have them, and teach you how we know other animals don't have those abilities. You can Google a Wikipedia of elephant cognition, for example. It's very interesting. We are all just reacting to stimuli, but it is not simply that because our stimuli are more complex. Our neural network generates experiential experience as a stimulus, not a mere for that reaction. And our ability to react to those stimuli is more complex, reason, intelligence, and comprehension. But most animals don't have the latter, sadly. They have perception experience as stimuli, but all they do is react to them. They can never think about them, much less think about themselves. They have no sense of self like we do, no equipment to build any stimuli as complex as a self-model. They have no metacognition, they have no self-cognition. We know this is a scientific fact. It's an observationally confirmed fact. It is an anatomically confirmed fact. Sentience, in the sense you mean, is not self-conscious, is not metacognition, is not simply of a person, therefore not being a person. All sentient beings are information processors, absolutely nothing else, just that. Therefore, any information processor that does the same thing will have subjective experience. What information processor does that? We have observed to anything that produce an output of integrated perception. Do robots do that now? Yes. We even made a robot with identical information processor to an animal, a worm, that does that. There is, to the contrary, no reason to believe that these robots don't have subjective experiences. But having subjective experience not being a person in any useful sense relevant to how society employs the term person. If all you want to mean by person is having experience that robots are persons, worms are persons, every information processor producing integrated perception is a person, and that simply dilutes the meaning of the word. It then no longer has any significance to call something a person. It's meaningless. It's just a synonym for sentience, which entails nothing as to right, power, or anything. But it will not be when people talk about, can you conceive yourself as experience the subjective feeling of a robot? Yes, same as I could a worm or any other animal. But it will not be myself experience those feelings because they have no self, so there will be no me having those experiences. I could not think about them, comprehend them, experience them, or do anything with them cognitive because there will be no I to do any of those things. I will simply be a non-cognitive reasoner reacting to perceptual stimuli. I will be having experience but incapable of thinking about those experiences or related to them or any concept of myself. I will have no narrative memory built out of them. We already know what it takes of type of minds, right? Anatomical equipment almost no animals have, and we know this because we observed the correlation between having the equipment and exhibit all the abilities it entails, and lacking that equipment is lacking all ability it entails. It's just fact. So how do we know a worm robot has the same experience as a worm? Because of the same fact. We observed them, you had the equipment, you had the ability, nothing else needs to exist. There is no special secret ingredient or non-physical element like idealists and some panpsychists believe, like David Chalmers, or something that gets added. It's just a neural net that generates integrated perception, period. That's it, there is nothing else. Which means when you have that, you have the effects of it. Subjective experience. To argue otherwise, to argue for some special secret fluid, or something that has yet get added. But there's no evidence of any of that. And we confirm this by observing the worm exhibit the ability that results from having an integrated perception of something. It learns, it builds a model of its environment, it reacts to phenomena that requires more than mere tit-for-tat impulses. It is doing more than direct reflect action. It therefore must have some form of integrated perception, because if it didn't, it couldn't do those things. Daniel Dennett explained this quite well when his analysis of Shaky the Robot. Therefore, it has the autonomy that caused those effects. Therefore, we know it must cause those effects, and those effects are observed behavior and subjective experiences, extremely primitive and simple subject experience, but subjective experience all the same. To suggest otherwise, to insist there has to be something additional or something that gets added, but we have no evidence any such thing exists, nor any reason to believe any such thing exists. Perhaps subjective experience emerged only at a certain complexity of integrated information processing, and maybe that certain complexity is more complex than a worm brain, but we have no evidence whatsoever that's the case. But let's just suppose, what complexity does it arise, and how do you know that? Maybe it only arises in a human complexity, so that in fact even cats don't ever have subjective experience? They are even sentient. You have no more reason to deny that, to affirm it. If you are going to arbitrarily insist that some degree of complexities is needed, and you had no idea how much. But here's why that's not likely to hold up. It would be extremely improbable, or a really bizarre coincidence that an animal behave in a way that requires the equipment we know generates subjective experience, yet not generate subjective experience, and thus true for this animal is true for the worm, and if it's true for the worm, it's true for the worm robot, and if it's true for the worm robot, it's true for other robots. And I describe which even more complex than the worm bot. We know something of what it is. Any system that generates integrated perception generates qualia. We therefore have zero reason to believe any system that generates integrated perception doesn't generate qualia. If you want to arbitrarily invent some special point of that extra complexity is needed, that point may well be, for all we know, way past domestic dogs and cats, so your own reasoning eliminates even the sentience of these animals, and the only escape from that consequence to appear the correlation of this animal's behavior with qualia generation. And that argument tells worm and robot experience qualia, not the same qualia but some primitive qualia. There's no way to escape this conundrum. If the argument works for these animals, it works for worms, and if it works for worms, it works for robots. We have exactly zero evidence otherwise. If they don't produce integrated perception, i.e. they don't learn and model their environment or their own body, etc., they don't feel pain and they don't feel pleasure. Worms react to pain. Why then would we think they don't feel pain they react to? There's no scientific or plausible reason they shouldn't. It would be bizarre coincidence that when worms and eggs react the same thing, pain, and the one experience what they're reacting to and other doesn't. If you can react to the perception of pain without experiencing pain, why would animals ever have evolved the ability to experience pain at all? And what extra magical thing you had to add to get pain perception circuit to also generate and experience what is being felt? As the Corten argue, as sniffing the camber, is an argument against panpsychism. There is no logical argument to be had here. If two entities are reacting to pain, they are both perceiving pain. If they are perceiving pain, they are experiencing pain. End the story. There is only one objective set of observation that does that, the anatomical principles of integrated perception and the behavior that integrated perception caused that can't be caused without it. If you observe both those things, you have exactly zero reason to believe qualia are being generated by those systems. And those systems exist in all animals and certain robots. Literally everything that has a neural net computer configured to include B, a perception algorithm. And again, this is mute, because sentience only tells us which things can have experience and thus what things we should be humane to, like how to avoid pain and suffering, or if the very few rights are entailed by merely having experience. The brain is always trying to guess at the story of you, it's building a model of you, just as it builds a model and the world around you, but it's not perfect, it will get things wrong, like misestimate a distance or presence of water, misguess a motive, etc. But the only reason it does that is that all it because it usually gets things right. If it didn't, it would have evolved these abilities. So yes, when we stick electrodes into a brain or cut wires, we can confuse it into making mistakes in the construction of models. That's uniformative of what it does when we are screwing with it or damaging it. But it does have nothing to do with what we are talking about here. About, cat's brain can't even configure narratives about themselves. And people think they do, but scientifically speaking, sadly, they cannot. We know this because they lack a brain autonomy required for it and exhibit no behavior that will result from it. So yes, we already know that these animals, because if they don't have this brain structure to do it, they physically can't possibly be doing it. Metacognition, being able to think about those other things and act on that information. Self-cognition, being able to think about oneself as a person and one's own thoughts and desire and act on that information. This is what is. Don't confuse intelligence, which even worms have, and even robots have now, with metacognition and self-cognition. They are not the same thing. Person does not mean an entity that has some intelligence. If it did, then it would just mean learning algorithm. And as even robots exhibit learning intelligence now, and all animals do, even worms and genads. But if a person just means learning algorithm, it doesn't mean anything useful. There are differences in cognitive experience between advanced robots and animals and people, but there are also commonalities. They all experience qualia, and already know we have humanitarian obligations to animals because they experience suffering. But for most animals, still are persons and have no self-concept, and sadly this is like capitalism abusing animals to make profit, sadly. All evidence point to functionalism, computationalism, the functionalist approach of mind brain identity, we also know temperament, and psychological view of personal identity, that in order to have consciousness and by extension personal identity, you need a physical structure. Full stop. For the idealist, this is impossible. You cannot have consciousness if it's not physical. Consciousness requires the organization of a computer with high specific complex, obviously very little matter in the universe will be producing it, and that consciousness requires organization of a computer with high specific complexity is evident. The consciousness arrives from organization of a computer with specified complexity. We have no evidence anything else to require. And abundant evidence all that is required. So this is all we have. So organized information process neural network and anything is all we know. That's all we have, and there's nothing else to say. Everything, if the neuroscience established 6 lines of configured evidence, there's more, and then nothing more is involved in producing human consciousness than physical information processing. For example, you create a cognitive twin and kill them. Unless you don't, then resurrect them or something like that. That's the objective reality of neuroscience. Indeed, just physics, full stop. The mere fact that we don't confidently twin ourselves is trivial. We could have been like amoebas or reproduce this very way. It's merely an accident evolution that we reproduced not by cognitive twinning, but by genetic mixing, which is also by accident of history, because sometimes create only genetics, not cognitive twins. If on the other hand, if the about changing a person's brain has mind changed constantly as to trees and houses and nations, you evidently had confused a completely unusable concept of identity, one that could allow me to legally steal everything new of, basically, under the capitalist society, apparently. Este, as for true brains, they are biologically connected with a single neuron cell. A single neural cell could be incapable of sustaining a conscious link between them. Some brains will be true separate brains, even more so than a split brain patient who has substantial number of surviving connections in the billions. Yet one half of their brain remembers and sees and learns and things the other does not, thus have a different causal history. They are thus halfway between being one person and the two different separate people, and the only thing preventing the latter are those connections yet remaining, which are basal and thus more fundamental to personhood. Even so, then one half is separate consciously from the other solely due to physical severing of physical neurons, refuse any notion that anything non-physical is going on in producing their consciousness. So even the example of trying to use idealist approach refutes this. Meanwhile, all other samples, they're just a single brain, not a separate brain, they would thus generate a single distinct person, separate consciousness. So, yeah. And by consequence, nothing in neuroscience rules out the future production of superbrain, superconscious, precisely because of the necessary and sufficient link between physical structure and consciousness neuroscience has implied proved to date, and nothing in neuroscience rules out the possibility of isolated sub-brain conscience, human and subhuman, but in fact prove them physically possible and explain their existence solely in physical facts. A split-brain patient exhibits dual consciousness. A person to sum of memory, personality traits, and desires, and every other skill like attributes, and distinguish them in individual combined with the ability. Models on the cells. Every single one of those things have been proven to be physical product of the physical computation in a physical organ, without which the property cease to operate or exist. This has been confirmed by many lines of evidence. Okay, I don't know how to explain this. If you want why almost all neuroscientists are functionalist, computationalist, and token identity theorists, is why you are evidence like these. 1. General brain functioning correlation. Never once has everyone ever observed a human mind functioning in the absence of a functioning brain and a function or any physical structure. 2. Specific brain function correlation. For every individual function of a consciousness, nothing mental happens without something physical happening. 3. Positive evidence mapping the mind to the brain. Nearly every conceivable mental event has been identified with the physical location in the brain that has been mapped. 4. Negative evidence mapping the mind to the brain. We can remove a property of consciousness by removing the physical circuit that generates it, i.e. we can remove your ability to identify faces by removing the face recognition circuit, yet the rest of your consciousness remain. We can remove your ability to see a color by removing the color recognition circuit, yet the rest of your consciousness remain. We can create two partially separate consciousness in one brain by physically cutting the wiring between the two halves of the brain, and this which one side is not aware of what the other side is experiencing, and so on. Brain chemistry and mental function. When the brain lacks certain chemicals or has too much, the mind will fail in certain ways or change in personality. The mind can be so affected by brain chemistry that makes more sense on mind-brain physicalism than any other theory. Comparative autonomy and explicability. The mental powers of animals increase in direct correlation to the increased complexity of their brains, and in every species, when an animal, including humans, develops its mental abilities further or gains skills, memories, cognitive ability, etc., this is always matched by the development of neurons or synapses in their brain. None of these things is likely of anything non-physical was causing any of these effects we collectively call consciousness, but all these things are likely if the physical operation of physical circuitry is causing them. The likelihood ratio thus strongly supports reductive physicalism of mind-brain identity theory, functionalism, and computationalism. It will be a waste of resource to investigate anything that isn't the case. That's why this reductive physicalism follows from covenant line of evidence, not single line of evidence. We can remove a function, we can stimulate a function, we can restore a function, we can alter a function. Never have we found any function remains of any memory of it either apart from the brain. The causal cascade is always physical. For instance, we can physically trace the brain circuit that invents the color yellow. It is a processor that takes the RGB inputs from the eye and calculates when a different signal should produce yellow, but it is different place than RGB circuits and is physical wire from them. A physical wire comes out which can cut and the signal will get another processing circuit of the brain. We can observe that the signal doesn't get there, altering consciousness accordingly. If you need to explain why brain damage study accomplished, but it should be obvious. If awareness of people's faces, for example, requires the brain circuit that does that, and removing that circuit removes that ability and thus all memory associated with doing it. So it's not like there is a second brain somewhere accomplishing these tasks accordingly while the first brain fails to do either. There isn't any way to claim that this ability survives the removal or the destruction of that part of the brain. And as every function of consciousness has been correspondingly traced to corresponding brain circuit that once removes that ability. If we remove all of them, there is nothing left that will count as consciousness, much less a person whose collection of memories and productivity, skills, so on, all of which has been proven cease to exist when that part of the brain is removed. And will people argue why you just assume a priori? No, argument from physics only works empirically. There is no a priori reason. A second substance or a dimensionless point or matterless volume possessed of mind properties could also engage in energy exchange with normal matter and force particles. So the issue is not that this is impossible, but that it simply is observed. So the hypothesis of something non-physical approach to consciousness is empirically is false, not logically impossible. If any of that stuff exists, it will based on physics and harmony with all other physics. So dualism is not impossible conceptually, but it's just false empirically. Only dualism that are radically non-physical might be logically impossible, but it's hardly hard to describe such a thing. Such a mind must lack not just mass, but also volume or any physical distinguishable content. There is no way to describe itself just another physical entity. Just also means it must lack any ability to interact with normal energy and matter. It can have no EM charge or the ability to generate EM charge or so to move anything, which would be self-contradictory. How could a mind particle, if we have to describe, produce observable effect in the world and not interaction with anything that the physical world? That's a direct contradiction of description. There is a sense which only dualism are just another version of physicalism, like ectoplasm model. They can logically explain anything. And the idealism is generally fueled by Occam's razon. No idealism is ever needed to explain anything, never distinctly explain anything, and it tells positive extremely bizarre entities nowhere in evidence. One hardly have the appeal to convolute arguments about brain damage to dismiss this. So it's very hard to say. And like I said about the personhood, narrative memory is what it sounds like. You remember yourself and your life in the form of casual narrative, which memory you can move around is consciously and thus pick a time in your life to recall and relay is casually to times before and after all the way you know, then hence into future where you can consciously plan, which sadly most animals do not. This is one component of what constitutes a personal generally, a self-model consciously explorable. Your brain builds a coordinate model of you as an individual in all of its possibilities, desires, plans, and the like. You are thus capable of thinking of yourself as an I and other as a you or a they. You can navigate around your self-model the same way You and many animals can navigate around the model of their external environment, which entail and correspond to scale of metacognition. You can model other minds besides your own and thus understand the precisely what other people are thinking and experiencing and wanting and so on, and also track their narrative history. In short, conscious awareness of existing and existence, all that entails, and the story. And as Daniel Dennett, even though he's heading for the non-reductive physicalist illusionist approach, but when he was a reductive physicalist functionalist, at the time, he was right about one thing, that saying the phenomena doesn't exist, it does not say phenomena doesn't exist at all. He's saying they are made of anything, but just things you are being tricked into thinking you are seeing. But that is exactly the same thing as seeing those things. Indeed, that is his point. There being no necessarily different, there is no need of any other explanation, has no need of figment. It's all just computation. And there is no difference between the object and the subject, and therefore can be no such relation, thus qualia cannot be separate thing. To process information a certain way simply is to experience a certain way. Qualia are never actually separate from their observer. Experiencing them simply and only is what it is, to be certain kind of observer. This is not saying no one experienced this, and therefore qualia don't exist in any sense whatsoever. Daniel Dennett always says that they don't exist as some separate thing from the state of being someone experiencing them. There is a difference. And likewise, again with the qualia thing, when I see a particular shade of red and I see nothing, this does not mean there must be something physically different about a neural circuitry that produces the experience that difference from green or other shades of red or sound or smell or different emotions and so on. And that difference must explain the specifics of their differences. This is what philosophers resistant to the conclusion they got up when Nagel says what it's like to be a bat. They can't imagine what it could be, or so they conclude can, which is basic fallacy of a lack of imagination. Just like we can't imagine what would make quantum mechanics true, or we can't imagine how relativity and quantum mechanics could both be true at the same time, where obviously if we could imagine, we had solved those scientific problems by now. Likewise, qualia. So I don't see any evidential weight if we can't think of how. We expect that we can't think of how of anything until we actually figure it out. So this really just becomes the tautological description. Mine, the circumstantial evidence makes quite clear, it's going to be some physical explanation anyway, because we have already explained much that explained though could be explained by human experience and thought with entirely physical facts and models, so the line is clear. We also know why we haven't gotten there yet when it comes to qualia, because we need certain fundamentals sorted before we can even begin to formulate the testable hypothesis. We need to accurate synaptic and neural I/O maps of human or at least mammalian brain to even know what the physical difference in all these circuits actually are, and we are nowhere even the rudimentary step. One thing we will then be able to do is say whether there are finite qualia in a domain or infinite, i.e. once we know what makes the physical difference between color and sound circuit and between one color and another, we know if there are infinitely many color circuits possible or a finite number owing the limits to the IP geometry. But that's still another whole step away from answering the question, like what does this specific information processing feel like smelling cinnamon, for example. There's also a lot of science to be done, but there's not sound argument against there being fully to accord with physicalism. All science point toward being so, and no alternative even contain a competing explanation anyway. No form of substance dualist gives any intelligent reason why cinnamon smells like cinnamon either. So yeah, although Daniel Chatbot is a property dualist, so he gets some slack. And it is clear, unlike the illusionists who like to claim, that consciousness cannot be hallucination because it's literally a construct from real data. That's the only way it can even exist. This is why anything you ask about yourself is usually not always, but more often than not, true. Real memories, real desires, real point of view, both in the vintage and its blind, and the stuff that is more frequently false than the rest, like belief about your character or ability still being built out of real data. Your computer is just drawing the wrong conclusion from the data. When someone completely fantasizes self, we get personal delusion, like I am Obama, which we recognize as mental illness. And yes, you can distinguish between irreducible and reducible qualia. A color or smell is irreducible, but experience of a flower is not. I'll give you a point. Qualia are holistic, not atomistic. When you see a color field, it cannot be reduced to pixels of color. It's a singular experience, and the actual Lego blocks are the circuits that, when activated, generate the experience. But the experience of the event of that circuit activation and integration into a complex virtual model are not separate entities. The qualia does actually reduce to a physical system, in the same way that running down the street does. The phrase component of the sensorium may be closer to correct, although these components are again actually physical circuits that could be swapped out with others, i.e. it will be rewired the relevant parts of your brain. Yank out, say, the red circuit and replace it with magenta circuit for the example, or a small circuit instead of a color, and so on. Your report experience would change, though you wouldn't remember what it's like to be integrated with a removed sensation circuit, because memory will require activation of that very circuit, and thus you could have a scenario where you have a false memory of having always say smell cinnamon instead of saw red, and the only clue that this was swapped will be your separate narrative memory, and those memory used to be of a color, even the color red, but you will understand the only conceptual you will have lost the ability to experience that color or remember what it's like. Some the components again are still physical circuits, which each of which correspond to a specific what it's like to run that circuit, and that we get to the fact that what it's like varies and the circuit itself varies, but internally is integration with other circuits. And also, what happens to the brain, why you see things when you're older, not because you're old, it's because of hormonal changes with age. If you look the right hormone cocktail, you might recover the youth sensation, but that depends how much the circuit itself has actually changed. As we learn, accumulated experience integrate merged circuitry, which is not correctable except with super advanced technology that currently don't exist at the moment. Note that there are a lot of clues on the circuit board of what you are saying. It actually can happen to you, would remember this differently if the whole circuit changed, and as then your memories could also change, as they need to be run on the same exact hardware. There is no separate set of circuits for running memories, only for storing them. And memories are not stored like a tape recorder. They are stored as a set of instructions for reactivation. The sensory circuit generate them, and this is the first place. So if those change, so will your memories. But the store instruction might not have changed, and that is where you can recover snakes at the circuit information. For instance, narrative memory is different from sensory memory, so if you record a narrative description of a memory and the sensory circuitry that run that memory change, you can detect incongruences between narrative information and the sensory trace, but this ceases to work at a certain fundamental level. There is no way to record narrative memory of what the color red is like, only that, for example, is a color and thus should resemble other colors in dynamic properties. Of course, narrative memories can also change. Our memory system is not entirely reliable, but that's the whole other problem. Another way you can detect change is where there is an integrated experience, like several qualia circuits operating, and only say one but not all of them have changed. And yet another way is intensity. As we age, memory and experience generally tend to decline in intensity. This is usually a product of changing hormone balances. You can narratively record the change of an experience being more intense, and even record the quality of what it's like to be intense, as the circuit produces while idea still exists, so that when a memory of a repeated experience feels less intense, you can detect that this is the case, yet not fixed. You can't make it more intense by a thought. That is hardware problem, not a software problem. All things give us clues to how brain is and is wired as we correlate such clues to physical structures and organization in the brain. We get closer to honing in and how the brain is doing any of this. We have a long way to go, but so far we have enough evidence to prove that the final flag will be planted. It will be some form of brain physicalism, having to do with integrated information processing. And that's simply amplitude change, more the same rather than less, like the difference between shining a bright light in your eye rather than a dull one. Only the intensity shift sometimes occur at the hardware level, rather than the actual quantity of molecular strength in those nodes changing, though it could be that as thermodynamics entail that will emit, expand, burst, and thus become more diffuse over time. The brain rapture the intensity and then dials it down once it starts to assume there is a new baseline. And the problem at the detector end, once cells in the eye, not in the perceptual end, the brain's qualia circuitry. You can still experience blue and green as well as ever. It's just your eyes are bad, reporting your brain where you are supposed to, because some of those cones are wired to the wrong qualia circuit. This is how we know, because people with inverted qualia, when they see red where you see green and vice versa. If you both know mutation for color blindness, all cones are swapped to a different circuit. So the cone that detects what we call green light all wire into a circuit that generates an experience of redness and vice versa. Dreaming, for example, is a random walk. Your brain randomly fires and runs circuits and particles integrated creatively into a virtual reality, which happen to be necessary to skills acquisition. If the circuits recently used will get the most activation, the brain used to that practice or whatever it thinks you are doing by throwing random variations at it. Needless to say, all sort of strange things can happen when that occurs. It is no longer constrained by actual sensory signal from the outside. And the problem is not being able to see the machinery that produces the output, like someone trying to fathom how a clock works, but they have no idea of a gears, much less arrangements of gears, without being necessary to produce the effect. All you see is the effect of the clock hands moving a certain way. This is why qualia cannot be studied solely from inside experience. You have to crack open the brain and look at the engine that is generating them. We don't have the technology to do that yet. Second, qualia are not limited to irreducibles. What generates qualia is the integrated virtual model, a complex of experience, circuits interacting, and I don't think it's possible, for example, that you just see red. You have to experience in some integrated way. As a field of red, for example, which entails activation, other circuits having to do with topography and geometry. As a part of a narrative experience, for example, which involves qualia having to do with passage of time, the thought racing through your head, and so on. Or meditation and certain drugs can think with this process in very interesting ways, but are not aware of anyone's escaping the necessity of integrated circuit activation. Qualia can only be experienced in a collected integrated experience of them, not isolation. This means most experience, though it will have analyzed components. This is a sensation of red, this is a sensation of passing time, this is thought, this is a sensation of a geometric space. It will always have unique or repeatable integration that have their own what it's like, because it's not just a bunch of isolated circuits. Those circuits activate together in a connected arrangements of meta circuits. This may be in order to do how memories are reinforced and diminished by neural pathway building. Your brain has accumulated so much from wiring since then that the old wiring has either been written over or buried beyond recovery within much more abundant and robust connections. But sensory signaling is not the same thing as qualia circuit activation, per the color blindness example. And qualia are experienced as complexes of experience rather than singularity alone. Then you can report change in experience entails your experience, so that the roles you are out as a philosophical you have experienced. So that rules out philosophical zombie. David Chapman is wrong. If you suppose you are only falsely believing you are having experience, this is why exactly Daniel Dennett theory of consciousness occurred, the marriage analogy. All things you are report only reinforce, not diminish the hard problem. Why do you need any of those experiences unless the change in them? Is this accidental or deliberate product of evolution? What generates those experiences? Why does only generate those and only them? And why do they change? Why do the most of your brain keep functioning without generating any? These are all the hard problem. That problem doesn't go away. An illusion still exists, and in fact undeniably exists. For example, the mirage of water is not real does not mean the mirage does not exist. It must definitely does. In fact, that you're seeing it where you're seeing it. It's literally undeniable. It's the water that does exist, not the mirage. If you falsely believe you are seeing red, there are literally no logical differences between that and seeing red. In other words, this is what redness is, a present belief in the presence of a color. The only thing left to explain is why a certain circuit convinces you that you are seeing precisely that illusion and not some other, or none at all. So yeah, so you have to be careful when people trying to do these things. Well, people say, what about holistic and optimistic or opposite, like holistic and optimist view? They only at the same scale, they are opposites. A holistic understanding of a person does not contradict that they are entirely reducible to atoms. The one is simply look at the same thing on different scale. Missing the forest for the tree in no way means there are both trees and a forest. Thus, a field red is not reducible to pixels of the color red. It is a single divisible spatial experience. But red is not the same as green, or smell, or feeling, etc. Thus, the explanation of how qualia are atomized only to a certain limited extent, and even then probably indivisible. We know of no way to just experience the color red. It only ever gets experienced in an integrated model of multiple qualia, i.e. geometric shapes of space that is red. And qualia change is simply a question of neuromechanics. It has nothing to do whether qualia exists. When people talk about these types of conversation. And it's rather demonstration that qualia can only be experienced in an integrated model. No virtual model, no experience. The you are here is only ever realized virtually. After all, you exist even when not conscious of you, like you don't cease to exist when asleep. All your memories, ability, characters, traits remains present, intact, and currently arranged. Thus, consciousness of you is not you. It's just a virtual model of you that you use to study and understand things beyond yourself, as so as to be able to relate the model to other models of other people's minds of the physical environment you are in. But you are here is a physical fact, where your brain is, not a mental fact. Your ability to experience yourself is a mental fact, and that requires computation. The one thing we know for certain about blind sight, for example, is that it only occurs when the color circuit is physically severe from other circuits integrated visual model with the color. Thus, that color circuit might be experiencing color, but it is not physically connected to the other circuits. You cannot access the experience, nor can we, as the isolated section of your brain can talk nor engage in complex thoughts at all. All that remains is to sneak circuits to verbal centers of your brain, where colors are labeled, thus you can access what the color is named, but not what it looks like, because you have been otherwise physically severe from that microcircuit. But this is what a philosophical zombie would be like. If all experience was like that, nothing, whatever put the ability to identify, analyze, and name things. By experiencing literally nothing what you do, no vision of any kind, no feeling of feelings, or experience thought of any kind. Emotions will simply have their behavior and analytical effects, but will feel like nothing. Thoughts would just mean computation. You would never actually experience anything, experience thinking any thought, and so on. That's a philosophical zombie. It's actually conceptually impossible, but it takes some thinking to grasp why. But that experience vanished only when physically cut off from integrating of circuitry producing a model. It's one of many reasons that integrated information theory of consciousness is the most promising. This is why you can't even just experience right, you can only experience in an integrated model of some kind, involving spatial and temporal qualia, as well as color, and that requires complex integrated circuitry, not just the circuit generate red experience. You are part of the display. It's not a display separate from you, and you watch it from afar. The circuit generating experience are among the same circuit to generate the generating experience are among the same circuit generating everything about you. There is no you apart from that. There is that said there are parts of you don't have to have conscious at all. All your memories are stored unconsciously, and you are only conscious of some of them at a time. But you can become integrate you without processing those memories consciously, which requires the architecture for building a virtual model of you. That architecture is identical to the architecture you run your memories on the experience them again and think about them again. So it is not a separate to watching a HUD, you are an HUD in relevant part. The integrated model building works better than isolated sensory labeling. You need to build a model of the world to move around in effectively. Once you start shopping physical circuitry, disabling your ability to integrate information like color onto a model, you impair your ability, but there is no immediate reason why. The model shouldn't work without qualia. A coherent, complete, integrated model of the environment will work fine for navigating it without qualia, and we know this because we have built blind-side machines that do this perfectly well. Daniel added, which is this. Though conceptually we can have a perfectly functional model builder and model navigator without qualia, the separation of the two is actually impossible. Once you have a perfectly functional model builder and model navigator, it by definition will be experiencing the model, which means that those blind-side machines might not be blindsided after all. They will likely have the same phenomenal experience as a comparable animal, though not as a human that requires build of one's own mind. We haven't figured out how to program that yet, because they cannot. It's not possible to navigate a virtual model without experiencing the virtual model. Those are literally one and the same thing. It is indeed imaginary when people talk about this flight simulates view screen, but the fiction corresponds most of the time to reality, where enough that by navigating the fiction we successfully navigate the real world, that function was invented to model. That is in fact why we evolved the ability to build those models. When an airplane flight simulator view screen is based on external information such that the fictions of that screen match real things, a real horizon, building, etc. A person can successfully fly a real plane using only the simulator. This is what the brain is attempting to do by building and using its functional virtual models. And by consequence, quality experience is an accidental byproduct of, evolution. Once you start building and using a dashboard, for example, consists of integrated virtual models, the inescapable consequence of doing that is experiencing it. That therefore will necessarily be something like what it is, whereas the rest of the brain, though integrated on its own information processing task, is not integrated in any way so as to build a run coherent model of anything. The rest of the brain operates like an automaton, like a philosophical zombie if you will, but the add-on of the brain, a good chunk of the cerebral cortex, has evolved to do something more specific, to build a navigated virtual model of the environment as with all animals and of brains own thinking, unique to human and possibly to a lesser extent a few other species. The very moment it starts doing that, there is inevitable something like that is doing that. Virtual modeling is consciousness. This is a decent theory and a lot of evidence to confirm it, but it has not been proven, at least Daniel Dennett's approach of it. It remains a hypothesis in technical parlance, albeit a promising one. It still does not fully answer the hard problem and solves the why consciousness exists and the basic idea of how consciousness exists, but it cannot yet explain what physical circuit design with these effects, which effects are produced by which circuit arrangements, or why as in why those specific effects attach to the specific arrangement of circuitry. Daniel Dennett's theory gives us a research program as said we have a good idea how to eventually answer this question if this theory is correct, but it does not by itself solve the problem. It just tells us where to look. Qualia are finally reducible. For example, the color red cannot be broken down into component parts. Regress therefore ends, not continues. At the causal level of the circuitry, there is a finite circuitry that generates the color red. We can even cut it out of the brain, and it's not an infinite series of circuits. It's one singular circuit regress ends. The hard problem of consciousness is explaining what is about that fine circuit that produces an experience of red rather than something else, or nothing at all. There is no indication the explanation will require an infinite regression of any explanation as to where your dreams are happening. They are happening in the physical circuitry of your brain, located at your skull as to who you are. You are the total brain system, or at least the parts that store the core attributes of memories you identify as you, and that is a finite collection of circuits, not an infinite one. Likewise, as to what is the specific point where the system has experience, we actually have an answer to the question spatially and temporally. Experience results at about 20 Hz. The brain resonates at about 40 Hz, and so apparently requires true cycle to generate an experience. In other words, below 1/20 of a second, experience no longer exists. Likewise, we know which part of the brain must be interconnected and interacting to generate an experience, and we can already, with even present technology, confirm correlation between those circuits functioning and our experience being an observation. There is no separate person watching what is going on. The brain is watching itself. The brain's effort to integrate information into a coherent virtual model of the world and its own content is identical to experience yourself experiencing that. They are inseparable events. They are literally one and the same thing. The distinction between hardware and software is particularly the way we have designed digital computers. The brain doesn't work exactly the same way. For instance, mimetic learning is stored in the brain as a hardware, physically rewiring the brain, which explains why it is so difficult for people to change their personality or worldview, or habit or bias, and so on. We can't just remove the software from a program from RAM and install a new one. The hardware has literally been changed. The closest analog to a software in the human brain is what we call working memory. It is the program we are running on the hardware and that sits on top of it for a very few minutes before fading away. Your stream of consciousness is a software routine. This does not require physical rewiring of the brain, but for that reason, they only lasts minutes. We have to keep uploading and running new software every minute to stay conscious, and even then, insofar as any of these generates memories of learning, those are stored by hardware rewiring, not in anything equivalent to RAM. They say you are correct to the point there is another layer of software on top of all that culture, but this exists only insofar it exists in rewiring hardware of the people carrying that culture around and spreading it, though communication and memes, or the external information reposition like books. And likewise, you are right to point out, for example, when we experience red, a world of personal and shared experience are invoked. Not only is our red circuit wired into a whole plethora of hardwired memories and other accumulated learning information, but the causal connections that outside the brain into a broader socio-historical causal system which we are a part, and our brains can reflect the even stored model of the causal system and its hardware, and that model can even carry effects on the brain, software, and hardware. Thus, when you believe the world to be as impactful causal as what the world really is, in some respect more so. Ideas and metaphors are emergent causal effects of consciousness. Rather than its required causes, consciousness arises from the need to build virtual models of, first, the environment, animal consciousness, and second, what the brain itself is doing, human consciousness, the latter being much more complicated model to run, and having evolved far later than the other equipment did. The ability to creatively assemble and work with causal models, particularly of oneself and its relation to the world, necessary to produce also ability to such as the ability to use analogies and metaphors, to make and use tools, and tools mean not just physical objects, but craft, skill, processes, language, and government. Think of it. And to compose fiction, as predictable model requires the ability to create fictional events within a causal model and run the model to see what happens. That evolved not so we can write novels and play and songs and poems, whatever, but we could anticipate, thus better navigate our physical and social environment. But once you can do that, you necessarily can use the same ability to write novels and play video games. The neurons would have to change within minutes, otherwise it will never have any stored memory of that event if you experience at the moment, so to write about it. Moreover, it will have already been conscious before the event in order to remember what it's like to exist before it, and thus without the revelation, and so to even know what was a revelation. White childhood memories often don't survive. that at a very young age, our integrated model of ourselves is very primitive and diffuse, and consequently, memories cannot be anchored to being a person, yet are only at such a primitive levels as to not survive the further laying down neural pathways defining oneself as a person. Thus, infant memory becomes lost in things we take for granted, i.e., the ability to recognize the tree, say that we haven't been an original narrative memory of first seeing a tree because a narrative memory wasn't being formed yet. That requires a stronger sense of self to connect a narrative to. But even the bare experience of first seeing a tree will have been now completely washed under the accumulation of tree sensation ever since forming our singular tree recognizing circuit. Our infant memories are technically inside that, but not related to anything else, and so are reconceivable lost as distinct memory. As evident from the various writings, that is not the state the learning world, integrate sense of self and narrative memory and qualitative memory well before that event, and that is consciousness. In the end of the day, knowledge is always only a probability, and all is given in available information. Consequently, all we know is that the probability is of any given thing, given that we do know at the time. There's a logical need of knowing everything that know that. The one exception is present uninterpreted experience, which we always know with absolute certainty, but that's not what most people mean when we talk about knowing something. And in any event, it also does not require knowing everything, only what you immediately know, the context of your present experience prior to any hypothesis as to what is causing those experiences. And by the way, there's no such thing as absolute certainty of matters beyond direct sensation. But we are not living in a simulation. We can do that. That's just a Cartesian demon all over again. Just saying. And when it comes to regress, right, ends at the raw sensory data from which all hypotheses are inferred. Like exceptional cases of a basement data cannot be false. It has zero probability of being so. So it's like that's how it goes. That's how logic goes. And people that are like the Buddhist conception, like the self is an illusion. There's only one sense which a self is a quote-unquote illusion. It's the same sense in which the world we experience in our head is an illusion. For example, colors don't exist in the real world. Only photons vibrate in different frequency which have no color, nor do solid objects. Everything that exists is almost entirely empty space. We have experience as solitary as it's actually just the force interacting of electromagnetic fields. But our brain invents those things as stand-ins for things they do exist in order to construct a more or less reliable virtual model of the external world. So solidly, to invent the model EM force, colors in invent to model photons, frequency, etc. But this model is more or less reliable. We can successfully navigate the real world using it, so for all its errors or flaws or fiction, it clearly is even substantially incorrect. So that virtual model is not an illusion, in the sense that things it represents don't exist, colors don't exist, but the photon frequency that corresponds to it, even when they don't, like magenta, they still do, and magenta represents the overall overlay of two different photon frequencies. So solidity does exist, but EM force field that block light and environment and movement masses do. The self is the same thing. It is a virtual model of permanent context of a human brain. As such, it's an illusory element, the feeling that conscious is a singular experience from a specific topographical point and is separable from the body. Cartesianism, for example, is a fake as color and solidity, but they correspond to non-illusory fact. Your brain is in fact not nearly connected to anyone else, so you are, in actual fact, an isolated individual decision maker with isolated, unique memories, desires, skill, personality, etc. And you have a unique narrative memory that is more or less true history and that individual integrated collection of properties and data. So there is no sense in which you don't exist. In any sense of you that matters, an individual with unique memory, history, ability, and proclivity. And this is such an extreme, well-established fact of neuroscience. This is why you still exist when you sleep. Why you always consist of far more things than you are ever one time conscious. of. For example, if you do not go around simultaneously conscious of every memory you have ever had in your entire life, yet you do not consist solely of what memory just happened to be present in your consciousness in any given moment, but entirely of all memories stored in your brain. Thus, you are not the consciousness of you. The latter is just your means of keeping track of yourself by constructing a reliable, coherent, constitutable database of who you are and how everything you experience relates to you, like historically and socially and with respect to your wishes, desires, and plans. We know things the same way we know anything, by inductive inference, but the only way we could be fooled about these things is if we were like the simulation theory, for example, especially erasing data to fool us, is far more improbable. One should thus not confuse color exists with color exists outside our mental model. The former is true, the latter is false. We know this by very strong inductive argument. Likewise, everything we know and don't know about what photons are, that they exist, that has to be something at the bottom. There has to be at the bottom is tautologically true, but logically that thing could simply be a holistic mind. You may be the only existing thing and everything else is fiction, but that's not true. We rule that out again by inductive inference. As to a self being the captain that can still stumble, one can still confuse the acting commands of a captain experience events of thinking and deciding with the actual thing itself, the thought, memories, information, proclivities, the causes the decision made and thus, dunk. Even in a simulation theory or coordination theory, we're fooling you into thinking you exist and you were simply entity that would in and of itself constitute your existing. So it will actually be logically impossible for you to mistake that you exist. You can be mistaken about the content and probability of yourself, about what is causing and sustaining your existence, and even about how much you are even in control of anything you do. It is possible to fool you into thinking you are making decisions when the fact you are not, but that will still entail that was a you to fool and had this mistaken belief. The only logical possible way for the self is not to exist is for no experience of the self to exist, and for there be no dormant thing that could be experienced. Other animals live such an experience, humans do not, outside severely brain damaged state of being. You should have to meet both conditions, otherwise you still exist even if you are unconscious, so not experiencing a self is not a sufficient condition for a self not existing. So you need that, and for there be no organized self storing memory anywhere or any kind in order for a self to actually not exist. So it's not even possible for the simulation argument or coordination theming or a brain in a fat or any other thing. It's not possible, no matter how much we entertain or how much we actually want to believe sometimes. Like I said, like the law of computation, that any computation to model world must be logically a necessity to be more complex than the world model, as you must possess a whole extra meta universe for the computer to reside in, and that all that component on top of the components of the model itself, the corollary of which is simply computational model of any system. It's the system itself, so in the absence of any evidence for the vast complex epicycle cycles within epicycles, the odds variety is that such simulation or server or whatever system itself is like not possible. And people are like, well, mind uploading and cryonics is not possible because what if it's a copy of you and not we're you? Again, rejecting the functionalist, computationalist, and mind brain identity theory and the psychological view of personality, you have to reject it. But in reality, it is possible. Why? In reality, this is already the case. With quantum mechanics, we know quarks composing the nuclei of the atoms of your brain are being swapped out with virtual quarks all the time, so that from 1 second to the next, you just described has actually happened to you. You are being digitalized almost all the time. All the core matter of your body is disassembled and reassembled every split second. It just happens at a below a Planck scale in time, so none of that happen is detectable to motor instruments. So do you consider yourself a mere copy, or you 1 second ago self or that same person, and why? The ontology of this is called the teletransporter problem, and it's one of the leading areas of discussion in philosophy at the moment. But you can survive because identity is a casual history, not an ontological ethical. So no one ever really stays exactly the same as if frozen. So identity is not about being frozen in a single pattern. You remain the same person not by being the same pattern, but by being in a causal chain of past states of that pattern, and each causing the next, i.e., as long your past pattern state cause your present pattern state, not one to one, those pattern states are the same person in 4D geometry, a single identifiable person tube spread across time. In a transporter case, the past pattern organization caused the buffer to code a distinct output which causes a new assembly, thus causal history is maintained. Same as resurrection. Someone whose brain after dying is frozen in cryo and then resurrected nanorobotically centuries later retains the same numerically identical causal history and thus remain the same person minus whatever change may occur every second of our lives. Events change us, thus so would death and resurrection, but whether they change us so much that we cease to be the same person, we depend on what you choose to mean by same person, is therefore a semantic, not ontological question. If you ask me whether the matter of the pattern matters, only the pattern matters. What your brain is made of is irrelevant. As proved by quantum mechanics, your brain is never made of the exact same stuff from one moment to the next. Nothing about you is. And speaking about the cryonic state, in 2015 study by Susumu has confirmed to frozen that and digitize in a digital file. It's actually possible. So yeah, you can be cryonically frozen and be resurrected. It's actually possible in principle now. And yet, this happens to us all the time in every split second. If the nucleus of all your mad atoms are quarks, these quarks sometimes switch places with virtual quarks, leaving the same number of net quarks of the needy type. Thus, we see a continuous neutron, a continuous proton, but really neither enjoys real continuity. They are being swapped out with new neutrons and protons gradually over time. It's just the time scale is so small we can see. This is just the cinema films are really broken by black bars every 24th of a second, but that's too fast for our eyes to see. We see a continuous image of a screen, but it isn't continuous. There are gaps as one cell is swapping out for another cell. This just happens too fast for us to see happening. Needless to say, your electrons are swapping out even more frequently than quarks, and quarks and electrons comprise the entirety of your atoms. So imagine instead of a few hundred black times separating the disassembly and reassembly of all your atoms, we built a machine that could slow time and thus pause any moment your atoms had dissolved into quark C and hold the pause as were to much longer time, say a day. And suppose for the purpose this machine can wait for a few split seconds, it takes for all of your atoms to undergo this C change, since its individual atoms slowly bit by bit over time, not at all at once. So we had to hold each one as it dissolves after one another until all of them have done, though it doesn't matter to the point for the Theseus paradox. Actually, we're just a living Theseus paradox. The machine will be doing what you describe. Just imagine we can then move that machine across the country in the day that we run the machine off. All your quark C atoms collapse into a new atom and you appear where you would have appeared naturally a split second later. Now it's just been stretched to a day. You had teleportation by disassembling and reassembling by doing something rather by pausing how long the gap is between the naturally continued disassembling and reassembly of your atoms going on all the time. Why would that by any difference than is taking a split second and crossing a fraction of a meter of a distance as you travel in a car? Say, why would that amount of time in between when your cores go away and are replaced with entirely new cores make any difference to the continuity of your consciousness? And that's all this machine did. Stretch the amount of time. The rest is just what naturally happens to you all the time, every second, every day. You are not made of any of the same stuff by the end of any day than you start with. It's by then all been swapped out. You are the Theseus ship. That's not even theoretical. It's no fact in physics. So it cannot be the same stuff, has anything to do with who you are and what maintains your continuity as a person. You are not an object, you are a process. A process can be sustained by underlying stuff. The stuff is just means of generating and maintaining the thing. It's not the thing itself, and the process can be pause, sleep, faint, coma, and continues and remain the same process. Thus, consciousness and personal identity are irrespective of the underlying machinery recording and generated. The machinery can be swapped out seamlessly without you even knowing, and in fact, for quantum mechanics, is swapped out seamlessly without you even knowing. The process remains the same, and therefore so do you. And like I said, we had not yet faced a situation of cognitive cloning, so we had no vocabulary for that, which I think caused some of the semantic confusion when people discover about what if it's a copy of you and not the real you. For example, we have biological cloning, but no one thinks that, therefore identical twins are identical person, and the reason they are not said to be the same person is that they have separate causal history. They are not numerically identical. They are not each other's minds. They operate independently of each other, and so if they exist as cognitive entity, they were once the same identical cell, so they share a common biological history, but that cell contains no cognitive apparatus. A cognitive clone would be like a biological clone, only instead of splitting into a separate cell from the same shared cell, they split into separate persons from the same share / brain mind. We can imagine an alien race that reproduced through bonding. They just divided into two at some point in their adult life, and each one starting out with copy of the same brain, arrangements, and thus a singular person before the split, then being identical but separate people in an instant after the split, and therefore developing as separate people with independent causal histories. They are not each other's mind. They operate independently of each other. These people will be the exact person up until time and different persons after time. So now we know this is the case, and this excludes AI because we know they have sentience already in the insect level. But like I said, people have a weird confusion at what a smart AI will be. And I think I will play the singularity theories where they have a weird understanding how intelligence and technology works sometimes, right? But to give them credit, even though a weird one in that, is the singularity fans are right about these things. Machines will outthink humans, and by designing better versions of themselves that we ever could within 50, 60 years, maybe 100 years, depending, and the pace of technology will advance will accelerate. However, this is already accounted by existing models of technological advancement, like Moore's law holds that computers double the processing power every 3 years. Higgs law holds that LEDs double in efficiency every 3 years, and so on. Thus, the technological progress accelerate is already predicted. The singularity simply describes one way this pace will be maintained: the recruitment of AI, which is we're doing this right now actually. It therefore doesn't predict anything remarkable. It's actually mundane, and certainly doesn't deserve such a ridiculous name, to be honest. It's just very mundane that just so happen to have a catchy title, because there will be a limit, an endpoint when it comes to technological progress of how advanced the technology, which is quantum mechanical limit. It won't resemble a singularity. There is a physical limit how fast stuff can be dunked and how fast manufacture can occur. Quantum mechanical limit can never be overcome by any technology. Once we reach that point, the pace of technological advancement will cease to be geometric, will be like linear in this point. In some cases, stop altogether depending where your research is. For instance, we can reach a quantum mechanical limit of a computational speed and component size. No further advance will be possible in terms of Moore's law. And certain technologies, understanding the brain scan and stuff like that, we can technically read minds, although not like mind reading, but like to an extent. We only improve relentlessly long before we reach any limits of resolution. And when it comes to like cryonics, myopathy, or other technologies for immortality, even we crucial that a life scan will work for all the noises, which will simply resort to a destruction scan, like physically dismantle the brain cell by cell, narrow robotically, or by any other method, maybe as you go, and rebuild the brain with resulting data, which you then had to store for future reproduction or transfer for virtual environment. When you people think, oh, that's just MRI, but that's not the only scanning technology available, nor need it operate in isolation. For example, combining multiple MRI, PET, and CAT scans can produce increasingly accurate picture of internal structure, similar to what was done for Archimedes' Codex. So we also know developing other kinds of scanning technology. We can combine these ideas. In fact, if the imagining technology itself sets the pattern as in the past. So likely the future. We first had X-rays, then CAT, then the PAT, then the MRI, and then the fMRI. So yeah. So when it comes to like, are you optimistic in the future? Only optimistic purely from a scientific, mathematical, technological progress. That's it. Societal progress, I'm complete nihilist. Not gonna lie. And economic progress, just bleak. Like, oh fuck me. And when it comes better methods of improving like brain scanning resolution, we will inevitably be able to map every single brain process down to the individual synapse and fragments. Once we can do that, we'll be able to locate exactly where beliefs and desires in the brain, exactly that consists of both physical and computationally, able to fully explain why they exist and how they work. You can think of it just one. It's interesting to see it. The possibilities how we can learn these things. And because we know so much about Neuralink, parallel computing is no longer a barrier. So distributed neural computing networks is now a thing now, thankfully. In fact, we don't have to wait for humans to program AI anymore, and that changed the game. Time will tell, but the point is we're close enough that AI developers need to get serious about thinking in advance how we develop these AI without becoming amoral assholes. Which in a capitalist society they're going to be, because let's be honest, they're not gonna program them under cooperation and mutual aid as they're part of the programming. Alright. And like I said, what about how smart? Well, like IQ, the maximum is 130 IQ. People say, but what about people higher? There's no actual difference. The IQ is not how smart you are, it's how much that information processes in your brain and how quickly you can understand that information they gave you, right? A machine can take at 130 IQ 10 times faster than a person, an average person at least, and they can produce more output, but only by living on a different timeline from the rest of us, which could only limit the utility of machine-human interaction. And even that has limits. Such technology acceleration requires many minds working in parallel, and not one mind working in a series. The latter simply not going to be as fast as a team of minds employing a system of division of labor unless it can take as many times as fast as a person. There's a person slash AIs in the team and competing with it, but that's a whole that's all organizational skills. Give you how example how advanced they are in this point. We have AIs or machines that build other machines that are better than we do at this point, like Google AI. I think it does that. We already have machines that discover the laws of physics without us. The vast differences from few robot centuries. Yeah, we have functioning robot centuries for decades. The only difference now is the huge advantage in cognitive science. And the advantage of AI, super intelligent, whatever you want to call it, has advantage over humans how it's developed. For example, human children have millions of years of evolved system in their brain, especially for becoming socialized and empathetic members of a tribe. AI will have none of that and can possibly evolve in a setting like that. If AI is to evolve its own empathy and pro-social values, it will have to do it by some other means. For example, running billions of social interaction sims to tests, like game theory, for example, models for what values and cognitive ability it will need to get along. But that will require programming a desire for pro-social goal in the first place, to get along with our social system, and programming in special everything we know about how social system and social interaction work, which is tantamount to just freeloading empathy and pro-social value to begin with. So you may as well just do that, since only then you can be certain the end result will go well. Otherwise, you cannot be certain AI trying to teach itself how to live in social system will come up with a pro-social answer you expect and need to. Like for another example, fault neurosis, delusion, and other manifestations that humans have are precisely the thing AI more likely will get rid of, not require, because it will be evolved intelligently, not blindly like evolution did to us. AI will likely indeed have faults, and they will have peculiar to AI, or resemble at best things like psychopaths. Unless, of course, we create AI by simply free-loading, reverse engineering your cognitive attributes, just copy a human brain and running it as a sim. But that will require no period of raising the person. It will simply be an instant adult. It all requires original respect identical to the adult being copied or built by us, less or plus any modification we made. There is an importance. but we had the capacity to go all the way up to the chain rapid succession. Even in 1995, a great computer array had a processing capacity of a bunny brain. One simply need to figure out the configuration, i.e. the software. That's the only obstacle left now. Someone just had to point the right learning algorithm at the right outcome, measuring a rinse and repeat. This will happen very quickly. It will likely happen by surprise, since it's like a trigger rather than a mountain. A mountain you can easily build, but the trigger will make a huge leap overnight. That's why we need to start thinking about the morality of the AI, because if we program it to be like Hitler, it's gonna end badly. And when it comes to like the LaMDA, it like has conscious, which is technically no, but more claims in the future is gonna happen when we keep improving, right? Este, how do I explain this? We can confirm operationally and automatically that it isn't just running stats on wordless, but it's building a running virtual model. This is the best understood in a virtual system now, with detailed anatomical and physiological studies. We can tell the model of a cell even more complex and requires the integrating of the visual and other models, so we can see what we require for consciousness already in humans, yet we can see in AI even the stuff we can't see in human. Means we can even more definitely tell when an AI is conscious or not. A4 theory, no other way around it. We already disproved the physiological study of how the brain processes information. Behavior, substrate, stimuli, and the fMRI study have all converged results on common conclusion. For example, we can physically observe that a visual system is creating and exploring 3D maps of the environment in analog and anamorphic maps on neurotic structures. We see square, there is something very near a square in the neurons that light up. The distance between edges of the square is being measured by the timing between a signal in the neural square. There is a necessary way to program. We know it is how our brain evolved because it's easier to land on the method unintelligibly. We have confirmed this substructurally. Lose a piece of the brain and see what happens to the processing, and electrical stimulate piece of the brain, watch what happened, and through fMRI imagery. This is how we know names of tools are stored in one place in the brain, but shapes of tools in another, and without the shape section, we can't connect the names to any actual tools. Behavioral observation and computer modeling have also recreated the map. The brain runs in many systems. The brain predicts the motion of football and assembles perception of complex objects from pattern matching, and telling the difference between leaves and just globs of color using Bayesian prediction modeling. And when it comes to actually achieving consciousness in AI, not whether we can parse out an entire neural network operation that might one day be possible in theory but isn't needed at any point. There's still an easy observable difference between a neural net running Bayesian stat on wordless and a neural net running Bayesian stat of throwable trajectory. We can totally tell the difference between these two systems by looking at the code and what it's doing, what register it calls up and what math it runs, and to call ups. This now requires dissecting or comprehending the entire neural network, just as the human brain, but how we can confirm they run models, not stats on wordless, and we have even less access to the parameter than a human brain than a deep learning bot, so we can do that on human brain, we actually can do that on a bot code. Just saying. And computers have been programmed to prompt us for engaging for decades. This is even a complex state to program. We can mimic conversation about abstract desires, so it wouldn't sufficient. Certainly isn't necessary. Self-consciousness cannot exist without self-motivation, but it's not sufficient since still can all be mimicked robotically. We already have AI that does learn different language, like Google Translate, have been running an algorithm for years that has honed its ability to translate in language to near perfection, and now misses almost only the sublist that requires high-level consciousness to manage. Note that in the industry, anything is AI that use learning to perfect a task that has been assigned. AI is everywhere now. Whatever general AI is what is meant by conscious intelligence. No one has built one of those yet, though no one knows how is in principle to build one without knowing how by using the deep learning and neural net models we already have. The trick is in exactly what is you direct an AI to learn to do well and how long it takes to get good enough to doing that. I think Google, sadly a corporate capitalist hellhole, has the research to do this. It's just it isn't, partly for ethical reasons, partly for financial reasons. Unless the conditions obtained from whatever reason we can communicate with it, somehow trapped in the network somewhere we can modulate any signal to us, or for whatever reason choose to hide from us, though it will become increasingly difficult to pull off as it will involve vast resource losing productivity, so human will sooner repurpose those resources, thereby destroying it, and its resistance to that outcome will end its hiding condition. An emotion is a simpler form of intelligence. Will describe a decision-making computer animals rely on until interactive conscious modulator was developed as a check against it. Computers already have appetites, all the things we establish reward networks for. We have programmed that when instincts, we like count words and assemble a sentence. Those are appetites. I'm fairly certain that there's always something that it feels like to be an information processing machine. The only difference is that at some point there isn't any person to notice it. For example, there are nerve clusters in the human body that almost certainly experience phenomenology of a pain, but when we block their signals to our brain, we never feel it. The cluster feels it, but is that all they feel? Its existence is irrelevant. It affects no one. There are people with blind sight. The center of the right brain process color has been physically severe from the rest of their visual processing, but not severe from center that store words for colors, so we can now show them colors. They report seeing no color, but when we ask them to guess what color is in front of them, they statistically better than chance. Almost certainly the now physically isolated color circuit is needed, experiencing color qualia. That information simply isn't being reported to the rest of the brain, except for the words of colors, clusters of neurons, so it's the only part of the brain left that can report on that, and we could confirm that the isolated sector is experienced, what it is like to see other colors. We could talk to it, but because it's intelligent, it isn't wired up to complete language processor or any full intelligence center. It can't speak, it can't even think, it just experiences color. It doesn't do or know or think anything else. I am sure computers, and to some robots, already have experience like this, but they are sub-animal and not anything remotely near what we mean by personal experience. Like Shaky the robot is a good example, like Daniel Day make a solid case for it. And I think that what people really mean when they ask about this is something more like, do computer robots feel pleasure or pain? And the answer has to be no, until we actually build something pertinent into them. Not our brain feels pain, for example, but for specifically developed pain circuits. So Evelyn, you need specific developed pain circuitry. I don't think we have a good idea yet what distinguishes that from any other kind of circuitry, nor do we know how to program a deep learner to go and find out either. But it's possible that sometime analogous can or even has developed. I'm not sure how information process is needed for phenomenology of rudimentary satisfaction / frustration on par with insects or worms, for instance, although we did not even have that. Is there a certain phi score needed in process part before that manifests? Phi being a physical measure of integrated complexity of processors, or one of the leading theories of consciousness, the interference integration theory, the idea being that a certain threshold there is shape shift in the system from mere mechanism to phenomenology generating its integrating and complexity both past a certain amount. Like the equating network for mapping correlated frequency on a huge list of words may be too complex to dig around in, but the network is an equation network for mapping correlated frequency on a huge list of words is eminently confirmable. Likewise, that a network is running an exploration of 3D model or anything else. The precise point by point may equate, but the general fact that the network is doing what can watch and tweak in real time. And this is what LaMDA is doing at the moment. Another example is if we point a neural link machine deep learning algorithm out something trivial like word association frequency, but as its own inner operation teaching it to think about its own thinking, it will build networks as complex as a human brain that indeed do the same thing as a human brain. At no point we will ourselves have to understand how that works. The algorithm will figure it out for us, and we have to spend decades trying to understand what it is. Like again, Shaky the robot began movement that has accumulated all sorts of environmental smart robots who learn appropriate fight-to-flight response, can learn without being told even the structure and shape and operation of their own bodies, and learn to navigate completely novel environment. I think we have definitely achieved animal intelligence in robots, at least in the insect level.